So hi everyone, welcome to this short lecture for Birkbeck Inspires. I'm Professor Roger Luckhurst. I'm in the Department of English, Theatre and Creative Writing, and I've just been asked to talk a little bit about my research. Now, if you've been watching the news anxiously, like I have, I guess you've been quite impressed that at last we've got back to trusting experts again. You've been watching virologists and epidemiologists and health psychologists talking with great authority about the current crisis. Not so much in literature or cultural studies, though, unless it's about the kind of consolatory function of art. But in fact, I think there are quite a lot of people in our department at the moment who really are, strangely, experts in this kind of area. So my colleague Peter Fifield works on bacteriology in the first years of literature about that strange new force. My colleague Grace Haldon has written about nuclear apocalypse and aftermaths. And Caroline Edwards, another colleague, has written on utopia, but now appropriately for the times is writing on dystopia and climate crisis and representations of that as well. So, we feel curiously ready. In fact, I think I'm here partly because I wrote this book called Zombies, A Cultural History, back in 2015. And one of my fellow zombie scholars, that's someone who works on zombies rather than is a zombie, one of my fellow zombie scholars said by email, at last, this is the thing that we've been reading about all our lives. We can finally talk about this kind of stuff because we've been thinking through pandemics all of our lives. So I'm here to talk to you a little bit about how I think that these zombie narratives in popular culture, in fiction, in film, in video games have actually been curiously influencing how we might think about the ongoing coronavirus crisis. Okay, first, I think the best way to start is to just give you a quick history lesson in the word zombie and what it means. It's got a really complex history and it's thought to originate in West Africa and was brought over with the slave ships to the Caribbean. Vast amounts of people taken through the Middle Passage to work on slave plantations. And that word kind of started to be used in the syncretic religions of the Caribbean. So you had Obeah in Jamaica, or you had Santeria in Cuba, and then most famously you had voodoo in Haiti. And it's where the word zombie is most associated with, is Haiti. It then crosses over into English language, first quite late in the 1880s, and then even later in the 1920s when Haiti was briefly a colony of the United States. And there was an amazing journalist, sensational journalist called William Seabrook, who went to visit this magic island, as he called it. And he was famously introduced to real, actual, living, or rather unliving zombies that he called dead men walking in cane fields. And within 3 years of him publishing this really sensational account, the first Hollywood film, White Zombie, was made in 1932. And in that sense, that's the first ever zombie film that was made. Okay, so that is just a brief sketch of where it came from. It's worth pausing, though, on another really terrible film from the 1930s, but important, called The Revolt of the Zombies, which came out in 1936. And that's important because it gives us a vision of a mass, a horde of undead heading inexorably towards us. And it's really important because that film was set in Cambodia, and it's a vision of an Asian horde, basically a yellow peril narrative, this idea of some vast, evil, monstrous thing that's going to emerge from the east. Now, the idea of yellow danger or yellow peril was very strong in popular culture and in racist thought in the early 20th century. And I think it's really one of the secrets behind zombie narratives is that it's really it's kind of a yellow peril account. And really, when you listen to someone like President Trump talking insistently, very carefully about the China virus, about the Wuhan virus, what you're getting is a kind of revival of that yellow peril narrative. And in some ways, it's been very much embedded in American culture of this fear of the massive horde. But the most important film, though, for just the absolute ubiquity of zombie narratives now is George Romero's film Night of the Living Dead, which came out in 1968 and is not for the faint-hearted, but is a really very remarkable piece of work in many ways. But I would just emphasise, I think, here that it treats the zombie horde as very much as a disease outbreak. And it's very containable because it's a small outbreak in the film, and yet in all of the subsequent sequels this outbreak gets larger and larger and more uncontrollable. So that's a really kind of crucial element to it. It's also very loosely an adaptation of a novel by the writer Richard Matheson called I Am Legend, which came out in 1959. And that's another really crucial book for us to think about. I Am Legend is about the last surviving human being on Earth who is completely surrounded by vampires that are trying to get into his house, break through his windows all the time. They torment him through the night. And of course, during the day, he's free because they're vampires according to their rules. And because he's a scientist, he's trying to find a solution, a medical solution, a cure for vampirism, which he is totally persuaded is a disease of the blood. So there is a kind of a rational use of science and medicine in this very apocalyptic novel. And these Last Man narratives go all the way back, actually, to Mary Shelley's book called The Last Man, which has a really amazing description of a world devoid of people following an outbreak of a fatal disease. So there's a kind of a whole lot embedded in that, I think. Then after Night of the Living Dead and the huge influence of that and his follow-up film Dawn of the Dead and Day of the Dead, we've seen increasingly in zombie films a globalization of this kind of image of the zombie outbreak. One of the most important of those films would be 28 Days Later, which is a British film that came out in 2002. And that features a kind of rage virus. It's called the R virus, which is transmitted instantly. Its R rate of infection is quite high because it gets the entire world very quickly. And it's worth watching, I think, not because it has particularly anything to say about medicine. It's very much just a standard gory horror film, very good, but gory. But it has this amazing opening sequence of a vision of completely abandoned London as the central figure, played by Cillian Murphy, kind of wanders around this ruined world. And it felt very evocative when I was walking through London during the lockdown, that this was a kind of sense of, I've been reading this my whole life, and it was really very uncanny. So it's worth it for that. But then the other kind of global narratives that I think are worth thinking about, just to kind of finish really, are these truly global visions. So there are a couple of films and a couple of resources that we might look at. So the most famous would be Resident Evil, and that was a film that was initially a video game which was made in Japan in 1996 and became a huge global success. There were over 20 follow-up video games that have sold in the billions. And this is a really influential narrative because it's about a secret corporate laboratory which is building bioweapons, and there is an escape of a fatal virus that turns people immediately into the undead, into zombies. And, you know, it's quite unbelievable, really, that the American government almost is watching Resident Evil and taking its attack lines from this popular narrative idea that there might be some hidden bioweapon secret behind the whole coronavirus pandemic. So that's a really important film and set of text to watch. There have been 7 sequels to that, so you know that will keep you busy for a while. Then finally, the other film that's worth talking about is World War Z, as I think we should definitely call it in this country. So initially a very good book by Max Brooks and a very bad film, but actually a film that's really worth watching for a couple of reasons. One is that you see in that film epidemiologists who are modelling how fast this virus is going to go around the world, and it's a scene which I think we've now seen on the actual news hundreds of times over, and it's a really striking sense that actually the news in some curious way is following the fiction. The other really spooky thing about World War Z is just this detail, which was when it was released in Africa, some of the images from the very end of the scene, which features just one lone African woman zombie caught in a room and kind of snarling through the window, that image, that scene was taken up by narratives about the Ebola crisis. And actually it was said that this was an image of someone who had been buried, having been thought dead, having caught Ebola, but actually had kind of woken up and was this kind of undead figure, and that this is what Ebola was doing to people. And you can kind of see from that's picking up on the idea during the Ebola outbreak, this terrible fear of dead bodies because they were at their most infectious at that time, and they had to change the whole burial practice of West Africa in order to kind of deal with that. And it's a sort of another example of how cultural representation and reality are completely intertwined in this kind of world. So there's my pitch. You know, I think the more you watch zombie films, and people have been watching lots of films about contagion, the more you begin to understand how we have been in an odd way prepared by our popular culture for this bizarre world we're in. That's all from me. I'm very grateful for your time. I hope that you stay safe and stay well, and we hope to see you at Birkbeck sometime. Bye.